Yo, feel me? I can't lie, bro. I mean, I think I'm at a point, bro, where I'm about ready to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, maybe Oriental Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy in general, right? So I'm coming from a Protestant slash evangelical background, or just evangelical, if you don't want to consider evangelicals Protestant. You know what I mean? Evangelical meaning like a low church, non-denominational, you feel me, Pentecostal type of church, right? And yeah, and I think, bro, what starting it for me, or at least what started it for me, you feel me, was being in this Pentecostal church or evangelical church, right? And I think what began this whole like journey of pushing me away from Protestantism, you feel me, into the ancient faiths at least, is, or at least it was this heavy prosperity gospel, bro. You know what I mean? And I think at first I thought I knew what the prosperity gospel was, but I didn't, right? Like I thought the prosperity gospel was, oh, the pastor just preaching about money, right? Asking you for your tithes and all that kind of stuff, telling you to give this amount and that amount and yada yada yada, right? But like, bro, it was one day I was sitting in service and it just hit me what the prosperity gospel was. I was just zoned out, and for a second I zoned back in. I hear my pastor preaching about how much God wants me to prosper, right? And every Sunday, you feel me, I was hearing the same thing. God wants you to prosper. That was the word every Sunday, right? God wants you to prosper. God wants you to prosper. God wants you to be financially abundant. God doesn't want you to be sick and yada yada yada. And like I said, that's what started for me, was getting tired, sick and tired of hearing the same thing every Sunday about prosperity, right? That's the prosperity gospel, right? Preaching every Sunday about how much God wants you to prosper, right? And the biggest issue that I had taken with that was the fact that the Christian life and the Christian walk is so much more than just prosperity and prospering, right? And in fact, another issue that I took with it was teaching me about how much God wants me to prosper every Sunday, but never telling me how to achieve that prosperity, right? Because in my mind, I'm like, yes, I believe God wants me to prosper, right? But I also believe that God, more importantly, wants me to be holy and righteous, right? And I think that, like I said, that's more important, right? So if you're going to preach about something every Sunday, preach about how I should be righteous, how I can be righteous, right? And through that righteousness and that holiness, that I receive the prosperity that God so much or so badly wants me to have, right? Right. So that was the beginning of what initially began pushing me away from, obviously, the prosperity gospel is not a dogma, right? Or like something that has to be taught in a Protestant church or evangelical churches, right? But point is, that's what just began. Like I just began getting tired of it, right? Because I was hearing it, I heard it there, right? Heard it at my mom's church, right? And I just got tired of it, right? And the next thing that began pushing me away from Protestantism, right, or is pushing me away from Protestantism as of right now, is I was praying, and I've been praying for a while, that the Lord would lead me into correct doctrine, right? That I wouldn't, that I like the fullness of the truth. And I was afraid to pray that for a while because I was a Protestant, and I was like, well, if the truth is Catholicism or Orthodoxy, right? A part of me kind of didn't want to know it, because a part of me kind of didn't want to be wrong, right? But I said, you know what? I love the Lord more than I love being right, right? So I prayed and I said, lead me into correct doctrines and all that kind of good stuff, right? Right. So that happened, and I was praying them things, right? And yeah, I've been changing my mind a lot lately, bro, on specific doctrines, right? For example, the Eucharist or the communion, right? Now, the what I've been taught and what I've taught myself in coming up in Protestantism, right, is that Eucharist or communion is only symbolic, right? And I was watching that debate between Deacon Meeret and Clifton Stewart, right? And he brings up First Corinthians chapter 11, right? Where it talks about what is it, like 20 through 30, or specifically verses 27 and 28, where St. Paul, right, is what they call them, the Orthodox and Catholic churches, right? Where they basically, well, Paul talks about how communion, like there are people partaking in communion or Eucharist, right, and they're doing it incorrectly. They're improperly partaking in communion, not properly recognizing the body and blood of Christ, right? And through this, they're dying, they're getting sick, right? They're falling asleep, is what he says, right? And right, so I began to think, and I said, well, if people are if they're dying from incorrectly partaking in Eucharist, right, then it can't just be a symbol. It has to be more than a symbol, right? And if people are dying from it, right, then the opposite has to also be true, right? Meaning that if people are dying from incorrectly partaking in Eucharist, then correctly partaking in Eucharist has to bring life, right? And I was looking into the early Christians, somebody like Saint Ignatius, right, the disciple of Peter, right, and chapter, what is it, chapter 20 of his letter to the Ephesians, he says that Eucharist, right, or the communion is the medicine of immortality, right? The medicine of life, right? And so this is the view of the early Christians, people like him and Justin Martyr and whatnot, right? Right. So I changed my mind. I said, you know what? I recognize real presence now. I recognize that the body and the blood of Christ are somehow truly present in the Eucharist, right? That is not just a symbol, right?